Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to Then and Now. I'm your host, David Myers, and today's episode will be devoted to the rising tide of gun violence in this country. In the past few weeks alone, two 18-year-olds undertook horrifying murderous rampages with assault rifles, killing 10 people in a Buffalo area supermarket frequented by African Americans in one instance, and 21 people, including 19 children, in Uvalde, Texas. These episodes, following on so many other mass murders in recent years, have renewed calls for imposing new restrictions on access to guns, especially the kind of assault rifle used by the murderous gunman. In response, the National Rifle Association recently held its annual convention where it steadfastly opposed calls to make major steps towards gun control. To help us make sense of where we're at, we're fortunate to have with us today Adam Winkler, the Connell Professor of Law at the UCLA Law School and a national expert on the history of guns and of attempts to restrict access to them. Professor Winkler is the author of the important 2011 book, Gunfight, The Battle Over the Right to Bear Arms in America. Adam, welcome to Then and Now.
Thanks so much for having me, David. It's a pleasure.
So you've written perhaps the definitive book on the contentious battle over guns in the United States. One of the chief bones of contention in this battle is whether and how deeply gun rights are enshrined in the legal and political order of this country. So can we go right to the source of so much dispute, the Second Amendment? And here's the wording: a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Apart from the grammatical and syntactical implicities, can you help us understand what you think the Founding Fathers had in mind?
I don't think there's any doubt that the Founding Fathers had in mind the protection of state militias. The original Constitution, as proposed to the states, gave Congress the power to organize, arm, and discipline the state militias. And anti-federalists who thought that the Constitution needed a Bill of Rights and were opposed to certain provisions in the original proposed Constitution highlighted this as one aspect of potential federal tyranny in the future. And so they wanted to protect the ability of states to have militias. And part of the way they did that was to guarantee that states would have militias free from federal interference. And in doing so, the framers also set forth that there was a right to keep and bear arms, that people had that right as part of militia service. So the original founding was clearly about militias. It says it right there in the amendment itself. But I think it's important, too, when we want to think about the place of gun rights in American law, to look beyond the Second Amendment. Every state has its own state constitution, and currently over 40 states have provisions in their state constitution recognizing an individual right to bear arms. And some of those provisions date to the founding era, and we have state Supreme Court cases interpreting those state constitutional provisions to provide an individual right to have a firearm for personal defense, dating back to the 1830s, 1840s. And we should also recognize that the Constitution itself was amended subsequent to the Second Amendment. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution was added after the Civil War to guarantee free rights, equal rights for the formerly enslaved peoples. And one of the things that was apparently on the minds of the founders, sort of framers of the 14th Amendment, was that African Americans should have the ability to defend themselves against marauding anti-Black groups like the KKK and whatnot. So if we want to think about the history of gun rights, especially gun rights that are associated with individual possession of firearms for personal defense, it's important that we look beyond the Second Amendment, too, to get a full grasp of the way in which that right has been embodied in American law.
Yeah, and I suppose this is a kind of cultural and social historical question related to those state constitutions and statutes. But what was it, extending back to the 1830s or even more to the founding of the Republic, that was perceived as so essential about the right to bear arms, which is a dependent clause tucked into the Second Amendment as almost an afterthought?
Yeah, well, I think part of the way of understanding it is thinking about it in terms of self or national defense. I think in the Second Amendment context, the particular concern was mostly about national or state defense. We're talking about a time where there was no standing army. So if you wanted to defend your colony or your nascent state or your nation, you didn't have a standing army to rely upon the way we do today. You were dependent upon citizen militias, groups of armed citizens who, when called to duty, would grab their guns and be ready to fight. We all learned in grade school about the Minutemen. The Minutemen were basically part of the citizens' militia that would be used if the native peoples declared war or attacked a colony or a nascent state, if a foreign country did the same, or sometimes the militias would be used for ordinary law enforcement purposes. One thing that's become part of the discourse in recent years is renewed evidence that the militias were used as slave catchers in southern states when there were when people escaped from the bonds of slavery. So it was tied to an idea of armed defense of a nation, something that I think still exists today and still very much a part of how we understand the world. But we just expect standing armies and police forces, people who are charged as part of their profession to do this defense work rather than relying on a citizens' militia.
So the presence of guns and the linking of rights to guns, you suggest to us, is neither new nor linked exclusively to the Second Amendment, and in some sense seems to be part of the American way, a certain maybe libertarian spirit of America. And yet you have argued that throughout American history, there's been a far more sensible balance between the right to bear arms and public safety interests. In fact, you make the point that the National Rifle Association, for most of its history, actually promoted reasonable gun safety laws, including the National Firearms Act of 1934. So can you sort of tell us a bit more about that more equanimous balance that once existed that seems to have disappeared? And maybe then move into helping us understand why it disappeared. But let's begin with first. Is that an accurate reading of your work to say there was this fair balance between those competing impulses?
Yeah. I mean, I think the idea of balance as a metaphor may be the wrong way to think about it, because that sort of implies a kind of even handedness. In fact, the history of government regulation is such that individual liberties and individual choices have always sort of taken precedence in America, or usually taken precedence in America. But I think it's important to recognize that we've had gun rights for a long time in a variety of different ways and recognized in different ways in American law. But we've also always had gun safety regulation. That it's a pretty recent phenomenon that people who advocate for the right to have a firearm for self-defense argue that there's really no place for gun safety reform in our law. The founders had gun control laws. They didn't call them that, but they had them. They strongly believed that individuals should have access to firearms. They thought that was a necessity for national defense. But they also had gun control. The founders barred large portions of the population from possessing guns, including enslaved people, free blacks, and even white men who opposed the revolution. I'm not talking about traitors, but just loyalists who thought that declaring war on the most powerful nation in the world at the time, England, was a mistake. But the founders' vision of guns was not the libertarian vision that we have today. For instance, the founders had mandatory musters where gun owners would be forced to show up in public displays and undergo training and discipline, and their guns would even be registered on public rolls. So in the event of an emergency that required access to firearms, the government knew where those guns were so it could come get them and use them and confiscate them if necessary for use in a legal process that unfamiliar with us today, perhaps, but was known as impressment, where those arms would be impressed into service for the nation and then returned after the armed conflict was over. And if we look throughout American history, we see a story of gun safety reform as well. Southern states in the 1820s and 30s adopted laws restricting concealed carry of firearms. In the Wild West, sort of the heart of America's gun culture, the frontier towns had the strictest gun control laws in the nation, and gun violence was actually much more rare than Hollywood lets us believe. And so we've always had a history of at least trying to balance gun rights with gun safety. I don't know if we've ever gotten quite to the balance point, but there's always been efforts to regulate guns because they are fundamentally dangerous items, even if they might have some social use.
So before we jump right into the question of, so what happened to undo that equilibrium, or whatever the most appropriate metaphor would be, can you just say a word about the NRA and its evolution? I think founded in 1871, and as you've suggested, it played a role. It in fact contributed to statutes and other regulations that restricted gun access.
That's right. I mean, the NRA it was not always the diehard, no compromises opponent of gun control that we know today. The NRA was founded right after the Civil War, ironically, perhaps, by a reporter for a newspaper not known today for its support of gun rights, the New York Times. And in the 1920s and 30s, the NRA was at the forefront of the gun safety movement, drafting restrictive gun control laws and promoting them in state after state. For instance, restrictions on concealed carry and requiring permitting if one wanted to carry a firearm. When Congress was considering the first major federal gun control law in the 1930s, the president of the NRA was asked in congressional testimony whether it violated the Second Amendment to restrict guns in this way. And I think from the perspective of today, his reply is nothing short of astounding. He said, "I have not given it any study from that point of view." So the head of the NRA had never thought about whether the Second Amendment would be a burden on the broadest and most significant and far-reaching federal gun law ever adopted, at least until that time. And indeed, before the 1960s, the NRA's publications rarely mentioned the Second Amendment at all. It wasn't until the NRA was transformed in the 1970s that the Second Amendment became the organization's heart and soul.
Right. So I think that is the question. What happened? You've identified it for us as a moment in the 1970s, that moment at which the Second Amendment did become the source of exclusive attention and a paramount value, seemingly above others. What happened in the 1970s to effect this change?
Well, two main things happened. I think the NRA changed and America changed. The way the NRA changed is that in the early 1970s, the NRA's leadership was interested in retreating from political activity and focusing the organization on outdoors activity, hunting, wildlife preservation, and moving headquarters out of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area and to Colorado, where environmentalism or wilderness protection was a more central issue. And this angered a group of hardliners among the membership. And these hardliners thought that guns were primarily useful not for shooting ducks, but for protecting yourself at a time in America where there were starkly rising crime rates, where life in the inner city and in big cities was thought to be quite dangerous. That's both a racialized understanding, but also one that responds to the fact that cities like New York were on the verge of bankruptcy and crime really was rampant in these places. And so these hardliners organized a coup, if you will, at the annual membership meeting of the NRA's group. We always read about in the newspaper when the NRA has their annual meeting. And it was one of these annual meetings back in 1977 in Cincinnati where this group of hardliners organized and staged a coup to overthrow the then leadership of the NRA. And when the sun rose the next day, it was an entire new set of leaders for the NRA. And those leaders were committed to politics and to fighting for the Second Amendment and fighting against gun safety laws. And so the NRA was radically transformed at that moment and has never looked back since. The other thing that's changed is America's changed, that the NRA, and we've seen in the 1980s, right around that same time, we saw the rise of the new right. and an important part of the coalition of the new right in America that sped Ronald Reagan to the presidency and several other presidents since. And the NRA was an important coalition partner in bringing out the vote, providing money and financing and thought leadership to the conservative movement in America. And as America changed and this right-wing coalition took power in America, the NRA was front and center and right there in the mix, and became an important and valued contributor to the conservative coalition.
It's interesting. I've just written a book with Nomi Stolzenberg about a religious community that takes rise around the same time, and at a moment when we see that same conservative movement advancing the agenda of religious liberties, sort of parallel to the new veneration of the Second Amendment. And both, if we trace the arc of those two movements, they certainly operate in parallel and bespeak an extraordinary success. This history of the last 40 or 45 years has been one of extraordinary success for both the discourse of religious liberties and the new interpretation of the Second Amendment. I don't know if there are any links between the two that you'd like to speak to, but it's part of the same conservative movement that has clearly transformed so much of American legal, political, and constitutional understanding.
That's right. And I think that there's an excellent article on the emergence of this new era of gun rights and the new rhetoric of gun rights, written by Professor Reva Siegel at Yale Law School. In the Harvard Law Review some years ago about what she calls the living constitutionalism behind the Heller case and the rise of modern gun rights. And what she tells, the story she tells there is really about the Richard Scalfes and many of the same people who were behind the revival of conservative religious politics were behind conservative gun politics. They appealed to the same groups of Americans, white, often rural Americans who found a lot of sort of their emotional, or founded a lot of their emotional energy in that idea of God and guns. So it was often some of the same money and the same people that were involved in both of these disputes. So they have grown in tandem. And I think we're likely to see, David, in the future with the new Supreme Court taking a very distinctly conservative turn, that we're likely to see in the next couple of years expansion of gun rights and expansion of religious liberty. And we've already seen the beginnings of that in cases both under the First Amendment and the Second Amendment.
Right. It's just helpful to note when we look at the landscape today, that period in the late 70s when this new, very powerful conservative movement took rise, and the effects it's had in so many domains of life. But you mentioned the Heller case of 2008, District of Columbia v. Heller. Recently, two former law clerks as Supreme Court justices who wrote on either side of the opinion, Scalia on one hand, Justice Scalia on one hand, and Justice Stevens on the other, wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times in which they sought to find common ground, despite the fact that they had opposing positions on gun control. And you two saw Heller in your book as offering the prospect for finding common ground between advocates of gun control and advocates of gun rights. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what Heller is, and then whether you still hold to your view that Heller represented, the holding in Heller represented an opening that has not yet been fully exploited.
Sure. I mean, well, the Heller case was a case in 2008 where a group of libertarian advocates decided to challenge Washington, D.C.'s, then at the time, strictest gun laws in the nation, prohibited people from possessing handguns and didn't allow them to use a rifle or shotgun in self-defense. And they wanted to challenge that on the basis of the Second Amendment. They ended up doing so and taking a case to the Supreme Court, despite, by the way, significant opposition by the NRA. The NRA didn't want this lawsuit brought because they were afraid they might lose, or that perhaps maybe they might win. And then what does the NRA do for fundraising in the future if the right to bear arms is recognized and protected? The Supreme Court ultimately did rule in favor of an individual right to bear arms and struck down Washington, D.C.'s ban on handguns. And that's led to a tremendous amount of Second Amendment litigation in that decision's wake. We've seen well over 1,000, probably probably closer to 1,500 lawsuits brought in the federal courts challenging any number of different kinds of gun safety laws. Most of those laws have been upheld, but it does seem like with the addition of 3 new justices to the Supreme Court appointed by Donald Trump, all who are very, very strong pro-gun, anti-reform, we're likely to see a great expansion of the Second Amendment. And in fact, the court has a case before it currently that as we're expecting a decision any day or week now, and it will likely be an expansive ruling on the Second Amendment that will probably usher in a whole new wave of litigation challenging many of the same old laws that were upheld after Heller, which might be unconstitutional now. And do I still think one of the things I argued in Gunfight is that the Heller case may provide an opening for breaking the stalemate over guns. That part of the thing that really concerns gun rights advocates is that any new gun control law takes us on a slippery slope towards civilian disarmament. And Heller sort of puts a stop to that, right? Heller says you can't disarm the people, that they have a right to have access to firearms. Certainly in the 10 years since I wrote my book, there's been no evidence that my prediction was going to come true or will ever come true. Have to be honest about that, right? We've only become more stalemated on guns. It seems more divisive than ever on this issue. And so Heller really hasn't provided that opening, which David is speaks to one of two things. One, it just maybe my point was a long-term point, and we just haven't gotten to the long-term yet. That maybe we still have some ways to go, and that maybe that point will come in the future. Probably speaks to the second more pointedly, which is that academics would be better off sticking with the past,
right,
rather than
profit of the past rather than the future. Right.
Yeah, I'm really good at predicting the past. Predicting the future is tough.
So, Adam, what, especially in light of these recent trends over the last 14 years since Heller, when you did see a moment of opening, and now it seems to have closed, and all the more so with the addition of the 3 new Supreme Court justices, it raises the question again and again, what makes the United States so much of an outlier amongst countries in the world? And here I should just note that over the years, countries which share a language and cultural values like Australia, New Zealand, and most recently Canada have responded with some measure of alacrity to set in place restrictions on guns in response to tragedies like we've seen in this country over the last couple of weeks. So what is it? Canada has had a gun culture. Australia had a gun culture. And yet that sort of balance fell in a different direction.
Yeah, it did. And I think the reasons are multifaceted and complex, but let me identify what I think are a few things that have contributed to the phenomenon. First of all, like you recognize all those other countries you mentioned, they all share the kind of frontier mentality, frontier origin story that we have. So it's not just a matter of, the Wild West is so key to the American identity that we can't escape it. I think it's got to be more than that. And I think part of the answer may be structural. Right? It may be structural in that we have a federalist system with a very strong tradition of states' rights. Most other republics out there don't have that same tradition of strong states' rights. They might have a republican form of government, that is a republic with various semi-sovereign entities within it, but none with the kind of authority over states' rights. And the desire for states' rights, probably led by concerns about slavery and Jim Crow more than anything else, has led to a real solidification of the states' rights attitude in America and structures that protect states' rights. Among them, the filibuster in the Senate. A Senate has become, historians always know that the Senate's the place where good laws go to die. And that remains the case today. So I think there are some of those structural features of federalism and the inability of the federal government to really act in some of these spaces. It's some of which is also just kind of happenstance. David, I think that there was a point back in the early 1970s where Congress seemed ready to ban handguns. And it looked like there was the political will to do it. And at the time, gun safety reform advocates pushed for a broader law that would ban virtually all firearms. And the moment was lost, and it's never come back again. And since then, there was the rise of that sort of libertarian-inspired conservative movement that was opposed to gun safety reform laws. I also think a current thing that's really burdening us now on the gun issue and so many other issues, David, over the space of American politics is the political realignment of our parties. It used to be when we were young, that I hate to age us that much, David, but when we were young, the Republican Party had conservative and liberal wings. The Democratic Party had conservative and liberal wings. If you were a liberal or a conservative and you wanted to get a law passed by Congress, it had to be bipartisan, because there was no chance you could get your own party to completely support it. We've seen a real realignment of the political parties in recent years. Political scientists have noted this. And in our current state, we have a conservative party and a liberal party. And because one party supports it, the other party opposes it. And it makes it very, very difficult to find any kind of common ground that reaches across party lines.
Right. A recent article in the New York Times affirmed the structural nature of the problem, pointing not just to federalism, but to the fact that Canada, for example, the others have parliamentary systems, which allows the head of government to draw upon oftentimes the majority party in order to get things done, whereas we have divided branches of government that can completely paralyze the process. And that's indeed what we have seen in this era of arch polarization. So I want to ask a kind of difficult question, maybe seem intuitive, but there's a lot of debate about it, certainly if one listens to advocates of access to guns. And that is, how central a factor do you think easy gun access was to the massacres in Buffalo and Uvalde? In other words, how direct is the causal link, and therefore how urgent the repair? There are lots of explanations that are offered in the wake of such tragedies, and often they can map where you stand on the political spectrum. Just trying to get your take. Do you see a direct link? Easy gun access, mass murders of this nature?
Well, I think there's definitely a link between those things. It's much harder to commit mass murder if you're in a country that doesn't have many guns. We have easy access to guns. And by that, I mean, not just it's easy to buy a gun, which it is. Even in California, our state, David, which is known for having the most restrictive gun laws in the nation, very easy for you and I. We just go out today and go buy a gun. It takes us 10 days to a waiting period before we get it, but that's not exactly enough to stop us from doing anything harmful. And in fact, California only has restrictive laws when compared to Texas. When compared to any other civilized nation in the world, California has some of the loosest, most permissive gun laws in the world. So we have to remember that we are in a nation with very, very loose, easy access to gun laws. And even in the absence of laws, we do have easy access to firearms. Even though the law prohibited marijuana for a long, long time, it was never hard to get it. And the same thing can be said with guns. We have 400 million guns in America. And I think it's one of the real issues that confronts any advocate for reform in this space is that whatever law you adopt, there's still 400 million guns already out there, already in circulation, more than one per person. So people who are really determined to commit crimes with firearms or are really determined to commit a mass shooting, they're not going to have that much difficulty finding such a firearm. That's not a reason to say we shouldn't do more to try to make it harder to get firearms, but it is an acknowledgement of the fact that we live in a country with very easy access to firearms, and countries that don't have easy access to firearms, these incidents happen a lot less frequently. And even beyond mass shootings, just looking at gun violence more generally, whether suicide or criminal misuse of guns. Obviously, the fatality rate of criminal acts and the overall number of people who die from gunshot wounds is just remarkably lower in other countries. And there's only one possible real explanation for that is that they have it's much harder to access firearms in those spaces. And no matter what you do, suicide, try to kill another person, try to commit a crime, the gun is the most deadly tool you can use to do that.
And its use is rapidly growing over the last 5 or 10 years. There's been a very significant increase in the use of gun in violent events and murders from the use of guns, deaths from the use of guns, not just murders. So there is, as far as I know, but it may have subsided, some bipartisan attempts being made in the United States Congress, I think led by Senator Chris Murphy, which some believe will yield nothing of significance. I'm wondering what your prognostication is, mindful of all of the political and legal challenges that you have pointed out. Where might we go? And I suppose more importantly, where should we go in this particular moment? What, given your constitutional commitment to understanding both sides, would represent meaningful progress?
Yeah. Well, so one thing we've already established in this interview, David, is that my ability to predict the future is pretty lousy. So we know that. So taking that as a grain of salt, anything that comes out of it. So I don't know whether we're going to see any significant reform come out of Congress. I guess I'm pessimistic just from we've had lots of mass shootings in the past that haven't really turned the tide as much as many people hoped, but also because of those structural issues. Frankly, we have a Senate whose rules make it impossible for the government, or at least make it make it more attractive for elected officials to be unwilling to address any of the major issues that we face in America today. So it's not only we're not seeing good reform in the gun space, we're not seeing good reform in almost any other space either. And so we are all suffering from the inability of the Senate to get any work done and to get legislation passed. So I guess that creates a certain structural cynicism when it comes to reform. The kinds of things we're hearing being talked about on Capitol Hill today are range from restrictions on military-style rifles, restrictions or prohibitions on high-capacity magazines. Those are the magazines that hold more than 10 rounds of ammunition at one time. And we're also seeing some discussions about potentially raising the age to purchase firearms from 18 to 21. Currently, handguns are banned until 21 under federal law. It's not quite banned, but the law does make it difficult to purchase handguns if you're under 21. This might raise that for rifles and make rifles 21 as well. We're also seeing discussions about potential federal funding bill for red flag laws, extreme risk protection order laws that states can adopt that provide family members or law enforcement the ability to go to court and if someone's going through some kind of crisis where they're a threat to themselves or to others, those firearms can be taken away. So those are some of the kinds of things we're seeing discussed in Congress. One of the things we do have to keep in mind is whatever Congress adopts, if they were to adopt some kind of meaningful reform, and in the absence of Congress doing it, we're going to see more activity at the state level, and some states, because of partisan divide, will be able to get some reform through, is that whatever reform you adopt is now going to have to go before the Supreme Court. For almost all of American history, states and Congress could adopt gun laws without any fear that the federal courts would strike down those laws in the name of the Second Amendment. But that's no longer the case. And if Congress were, for instance, to pass a ban on high-capacity magazines, I think it's very likely that the Supreme Court would step in and strike that law down as unconstitutional.
Sounds like a reasonably dire future ahead of us.
Well, so David, are you feeling differently about the future of America?
I am not, Adam, I must confess.
I'm trying to figure out how I can move to New Zealand. So, no, I'm not very, I do think that, look, there's a lot going on in American politics that's very disheartening, especially for those people who want to see any kind of significant reform of guns. But I think there might be some spaces for things that can happen or should happen, both activity at the state level and state level reform, where we are seeing some activity. Unfortunately, like America, that's divided too. There's red states making it more permissive and making it easier to carry guns on the streets. And then there's blue states that are making it a little bit more challenging to get access to firearms or restricting certain kinds of firearms in certain kinds of ways. So we are likely to see at the state level a real divide in different approaches. I think it's important for the gun safety reform community to take gun violence as a public health problem, where you can't eliminate mass shootings, you can't eliminate crime or suicide. What you have to do is try to take a multifaceted, evidence-based approach where you can lower those numbers, reduce the number of people who die every day from gun violence in America. That's got to be the goal, rather than eliminating gun violence or getting rid of all the firearms. And there are things we can do there, things that have a proven track record of success, community intervention programs like Operation Ceasefire, where bring together community leaders leaders, former gang leaders, law enforcement, and do outreach to what turns out to be, as social scientists have found and criminologists have found, actually a remarkably small percentage of the people who, many of whom can be identified in advance or while they're in that age period of committing crimes, and have outreach to them. Those have proven successful in the cities in which they've been used. It's something we need to focus on, that the Supreme Court's not going to strike down. Increasing federal law enforcement to crack down on gun trafficking. A lot of guns are out there being trafficked. We need to crack down on gun trafficking. But the NRA has really handcuffed the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the main federal law enforcement agency in this space. So we need to unshackle the ATF and let it actually go do its job and enforce our gun laws. There are things that we can do that will avoid Supreme Court skepticism.
And what drew you to the study of this particular subject?
To be honest with you, it was an academic interest. I was a constitutional law professor, and the Second Amendment was an issue that I'd covered and never really thought seriously about in my early years. I used to write on a topic that back in the early 2000s, no one was interested in, which was about corporate spending on elections. And no one in my business, constitutional law space, was particularly interested. This was years before Citizens United was decided and brought that issue right to the forefront. And so I'd gotten tenure and I said, I need a new topic. And I thought that the Second Amendment would be a really interesting one to start looking at. And what I found, I was really surprised. A lot of my own conceptions and preconceived notions about Second Amendment or about gun rights in America really were challenged pretty quickly by what I found as a researcher. And I think every academic is kind of looking for those moments, right, where you have a set of beliefs and you go and you do research. You're like, wow, the world's very different than I understood it to be. And I said, you know what? I want to tell those stories. I want to be able to share that experience.
What was the most surprising thing you learned?
Well, I mean, it's basically the subject of my book, Gunfight, right? That book is basically that captures most of the surprising things, right? That gun control, that in one part, that gun rights didn't depend on the Second Amendment, and that gun rights were pretty well established in our country even before Heller was decided. That at the same time, we've always had gun safety regulation, and the courts have rarely stepped in over the course of American history to strike down laws in the name of gun rights. And that often these efforts to regulate guns and provide for gun safety often sort of played some central role in important turning points in American history that I had studied before, but never quite seen through this lens. So it was fascinating to me to find out the founders had gun control laws. It was fascinating to me to see that the role that guns and self-protection played in both the rise of the KKK and in the adoption of the 14th Amendment. It was fascinating to me to find out that frontier towns in the Wild West had the most restrictive gun laws in the nation.
Dodge City.
So yeah, Dodge City. It turns out there was no reason to get out of Dodge. It had very strict gun control laws, much stricter, by the way, in some respects than the current laws in Kansas, where in Dodge City, you weren't allowed to carry a firearm. And today, Kansas is one of those states moving towards permitless carry, where anyone can carry a gun. So those are sort of the stories that how the role of the Black Panthers in shaping the modern gun debate. Just as an academic and as a scholar, I found just all of that a fascinating story that was kind of needed in a country that had only heard the NRA side of the story about gun rights and not the story of gun control. And part of it was also to have a sort of voice in the coming Supreme Court battles to come. I think one accurate prediction was that the court would start to look to history to help define the scope of the Second Amendment. And it's important then that the courts understand the history of efforts to regulate gun safety, that it's not just a history of a libertarian right to have any gun anywhere you want at any time, that there is more of another side that has to be considered. And we'll see how that works out in the coming years.
Well, although you've just given a very concise summary of the book, I do encourage our listeners to make their way to your 2011 book, Gunfight, the Battle Over the Right to Bear Arms in America. Adam Winkler, Connell Professor of Law at UCLA, it's really been a delight to be with you.
Thanks so much, David. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Maya Ferdman, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.